Welcome to the Henry George Program. I'm Mark Molyneux, and I am joined by co-host Jacob Schwartz-Lucas, representing EarthSharing.org and the Robert Schalkenbach Foundation. This is a program dedicated to finding practical answers to the housing crisis, economic volatility, inequality, environmental degradation here in the Bay Area and beyond. More specifically, we compare and contrast the ideas of the 19th century economist Henry George with that of both historical and contemporary thinkers. We address issues ranging from artificial intelligence, automation, and universal basic income to city planning and the land value tax, a concept popularized by George. This week we're here to discuss the work of Matthew Rognlie, who has to a large degree discredited the famous work of Tomas Piketty. In April 2014, the 26-year-old MIT student had just read Tomas Piketty, Capital in the 21st Century. Piketty asserted in the book that the rich are growing richer because their wealth grows faster than economic output. Piketty worries, therefore, that wealth inequality gets worse in perpetuity. In the early hours of the morning, Rognlie shared his thoughts to the book in a comment on a blog post. His 6 paragraphs were enough to get the attention of the site's owner, Professor Tyler Cowan of George Mason University. Cowan made a featured article to comment, and other economists took notice. Rognlie followed up with a 70-page paper entitled Deciphering the Fall and Rise of the Net Capital Share. Here on the program today, to make us all have more sense of this paper, is Professor Nic Tideman. Dr. Tideman was an assistant professor of economics at Harvard University from 1969 to 1973, during which time he was a senior staff economist to the President's Council of Economic Advisors from 1971. Since 1973, he has been at Virginia Tech with various visiting positions at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, University of Buckingham, and the American Institute for Economic Research. Tideman's academic interests include taxation of land, voting theory, and political philosophy. In 1987, he devised the voting system called ranked pairs, and in 2000, the CPOSTV proportional voting method. Welcome to the program, Dr. Tideman.
Thank you.
So yeah, this paper certainly raised a lot of eyebrows. I mean, the Tomas Piketty's book is perhaps one of the most talked about works of modern economics, and this paper really does a lot to raise some questions at the very heart of it. Well, what do you think is the general importance of this paper?
Well, there are two ways in which it's important. One is it casts doubt on Piketty's expectation or prediction, and the other is that it opens up a new line of research into the way the economy functions. So let me take those one at a time. Piketty, as you indicated, says that we can expect inequality to get worse because the rich don't spend as much as they earn. They're going to be saving more and more, and therefore they're going to be accumulating more and more capital, and this is going to make inequality worse and worse. Piketty points out that for this to be true, it has to be true that the share of output going to the owners of capital will increase over time as the amount of capital increases. And economists wouldn't necessarily expect this to happen. Whether or not it will occur that the share of the owners of capital increases as the quantity of capital increases depends on what economists call the elasticity of substitution between labor and capital. And the traditional belief of economists some decades ago was that the elasticity of substitution between labor and capital is 1, or nearly 1. And what that means is that when the ratio of the quantity of capital to the quantity of labor changes by 1%, the ratio of their prices changes by 1%. And if this happens, then the share of output going to capital and the share of output going to labor are stable as the quantities of labor and capital change. In order for it to be the case that as the quantity of capital increases, the share of capital in output increases, the elasticity of substitution has to be greater than 1. That means that well, labor and capital are highly substitutable. It's as if capital is close to being just another form of labor, another standardized input, so that if the price ratio changes a bit, people will just use a lot more capital. Okay.
Of these two systems where you've got the elasticity of substitution being 1 and greater than 1, just so our listeners get some concrete examples in their mind.
Like, I guess to phrase this as a question, you have, let's say it is a factory where people do things by hand. Let's say they're, molding clay, and then you make a clay molding machine. If it was exactly 1, does that mean that they are indifferent to the price cost of labor versus capital? Or what exactly does 1 mean in this situation?
What 1 means is that if workers are getting a third of the output when they're molding things by hand, workers will also get a third of the output when they're using a machine. The wages will be higher, output will be higher, and they'll be continuing to get a third. So no matter how much capital you get, laborers will always get a third. No matter how many people are added to the labor force, maybe wages will go down, but the share of labor and output will always be a third.
And in the case where it's closer to 0, because that's what many people would suspect, is that the elasticity is actually closer to 0, what would that mean in this situation?
Well, that as you got more capital, the share of capital would go down. As you got more labor, the share of labor would go down.
And then finally, if it reaches very high numbers, and the more capital you have or more labor you have, the elasticity would mean in this case?
Well, if the elasticity of substitution were 2 or 3, then as you got more capital, the share of output that went to capital would grow.
And intuitively, what do you think is the most plausible value for this elasticity?
Well, I did some work in which I tried to estimate what it was 10 or 15 years ago, and I came up with a number of 0.8.
There's actually a chart of looking at a review of different papers that Rognlie does in here, and between 0 and 0.5, most of it there, it's actually either 14 or 21 based upon gross or net return. 12, I'll just look at net because the paper looks at net return to income in each case.
I was surprised when I saw how many estimates were less than a half. It seems like estimates less than a half are the norm, you might say. So in my saying that it was 0.8, I was sort of on the high side, you might say. But you mentioned the difference between gross and net, and our listeners won't understand that without some explanation, so let me spend a bit of time on that. One of the things that goes on in the productive process is that capital is used up. It depreciates. And the gross domestic product doesn't subtract anything for depreciation. The net domestic product takes depreciation out. And for a long time, economists recognized it was very hard to estimate depreciation. They tended to use the gross domestic product as a measure of output, though they knew that net domestic product was the measure of what you could consume consistently over time. And more recently, the estimates of depreciation have improved, and there's a slight tendency to use the net figures more often now, although what you tend to get in the news is the gross figures. And every time I see the gross figures quoted, I think, wouldn't it be nice if people understood the difference between the gross and the net, and the virtue of using the net figure rather than the gross?
Yeah, if you look at this paper, you can see the dramatic difference. You can look at the net capital share, and that's really, I guess, if you look at the big picture, what is Piketty, what is he famous for? Saying, as time goes on, capital is getting more of a return, labor is getting less of a share. And if you look at gross, you see this since the middle 70s grow and grow. If you look at, and much higher than it was in the 1950s, 60s, and early 70s, if you look at the net, it's a whole different story. It's a story of something which is kind of flat with a large dip in the 70s and early 80s, which is which is not the story we're hearing.
Yes. The more capital you have, the more depreciation you have. And if capital is just being compensated for the fact that the capital is wearing out, that's not a true increase in the share that capital receives. So that's why it is very important to be talking about the net figure rather than the gross figure when you're concerned about the share that capital receives over time.
And there's some interesting speculation that's made in here saying that the actual amount of depreciation may be growing because of the different types of capital we have. In the past, a factory, has a certain depreciation, but now we have software and computers that depreciate and are fairly worthless after 5-10 years.
Yes. We have some things that wear out quickly, other things that wear out slowly, and software is a very different kind of capital, which brings up yet another thing. When Rognlie divides capital into land, equipment, and structures. And we know that there are productive assets that aren't in any of these categories and also aren't people, such as software and goodwill.
You mentioned patents.
Yes.
As well.
Patents and copyrights and software. And there's also things like water rights and spectrum rights. These are things that people get returns from. And when I look at Rognlie's work, I think, wouldn't it be interesting to expand it and find some way to include these other productive assets as well? Another thought that arises in this context is that it seems to me interesting to divide productive assets between those that are the product of human effort, like software and machines and structures, and those that are the product of government grant, like land and water rights and spectrum rights and pollution rights and things like that. It seems to me that there's a possibility that these assets that are the product of government grants are growing in importance, and that may have something to do with the growing inequality. If it's just a matter of machines and structures, those are things that are never going to be scarce in the long run, because they're not going to grow in scarcity value, because we can always make more of them. But there's only a certain amount of water, there's only a certain amount of land, and those who have the right to use it are going to be in a position of controlling something that is more and more relatively scarce as we get more of the other things.
Yeah, so I think we could talk more about housing later, but I think on that point, the paper, I after reading it, you really realize this is, really the primary focus: accumulation versus scarcity. The Piketty hypothesis in this paper is that capital will have an increasing share due to accumulation, which means that man-made goods, as they are produced and there is more accumulation, will basically control the market and get a greater return, whereas Rognlie says if the greater return we are seeing has nothing to do with the accumulation of man-made goods, but the scarcity of goods which cannot be made in abundance. Is that a fair assessment of what this is saying?
Well, I would say that that's a suspicion I get from reading Rognlie's paper, and yet it didn't seem to me that he said it clearly enough to be sure that he sees things that way.
Yeah, I guess what he does is he tries to show what it would mean to show that the theory behind behind a accumulation theory would make sense with net capital appreciation, which is just basically capital appreciation when you consider that it depreciates. And he does a good amount of math. I will say that I was following it along. I still need this is homework for me to finish up later to kind of make sure I understand it all. But he basically says there's a sigma value, sigma for substitutability, of capital and labor that needs to be above a certain threshold for Piketty's general conclusion, the smoking gun of the rising gap of R minus G, which is to say the return to capital minus the growth of the economy.
No, the G is not the growth of the economy, it turns out. G, well, I believe, is the growth rate of the price of the particular asset. So there is a tendency for land prices to grow at roughly the growth rate of the economy, but where he has defined G, I believe he has always used it to mean the growth rate of the price of the investment good being discussed.
Okay, so it's not a global term as much as it is one asset.
Yes.
Okay.
And it's not the rate at which the quantity grows; it's the rate at which the price grows.
Sure, it's the market value growth.
Yes.
And so for Piketty saying in I guess any asset class then that the return to capital is going to outpace it, there has to be a certain threshold of the elasticity has to be above a value, and it was already at a threshold which was considered unusually high, but Rognlie's work in this paper actually shows that it is quite a bit higher when you consider net elasticity, or the net return to capital, and
yes.
It's actually even more implausible based upon the data than really any economist is willing to believe, which tends to, I guess that's my takeaway, is that is Rognlie's proof in a way that it seems unlikely that the accumulation theory is explaining what's happened with today's data. Is that what I could take away from this?
Well, I don't think that Rognlie would use the word proof that you did. I would say argument or evidence. So let me restate what my version of what you said. In order to believe that it's the accumulation of capital that causes inequality, you have to believe that the elasticity of substitution with respect to labor and capital in production of net output after depreciation is greater than 1. And there's very little support for that conjecture. Therefore, we should not attribute growing inequality to the accumulation of capital.
So going forward, this is actually kind of a tangent. As machines, let's say that machine learning is just a complete breakthrough that makes human labor, unskilled labor, basically unemployable at any subsistence levels. Would that change the value of sigma, of substitutability in this case, or would that actually not change it significantly?
Well, if growing capital makes labor unemployable, that would be evidence of a very high elasticity of substitution. There would be evidence that capital is substituting for labor, whereas an alternative conjecture or alternative possible future is that as robots take over more and more activities, labor will find activities that robots can't do. More and more, we will move to a service economy.
And that's the big question of what we'll have going forward.
Yes.
And so I mean, and I guess there's a comment at the end, and I believe this is there was a couple different replies to it. I believe this was the first of it, which was Brad DeLong saying that this may show that this is not yet showing that capital is taking its share, but long term, you can't make any conclusions that and just to quote it, the only dissent I wish to make is this: Rognlie is correct today, but if Piketty is right, he may no longer be correct in 50 years, which is an interesting point to make, I thought.
Yes. There's no reason to assume that the elasticity of substitution between labor and capital will be forever constant. And so it might be that a time will come when capital is more substitutable for labor, and where the accumulation of capital can be described as a reason for growing inequality. But Rognlie's point is that we're not there at this point in time anyway.
And importantly, that is actually, Piketty's point is saying there is growing inequality, there is stratification, and this is his explanation of what we see today. And before we speculate on the future, we first need to do what we can to describe that.
Yes. Well, let's spend a little bit of time on the question of what is the explanation of growing inequality. There's no doubt that there is growing inequality. And part of the growing inequality is associated with the growing differential between the incomes of skilled and unskilled labor. But it seems to me that a lot of the increase in the share of income going to the very wealthy has to do with their ownership of non-reproducible assets, land and patents, and various other rights, taxi medallions, crop quotas, spectrum rights, and then there is also a growing number of what I would call monopolistic niches. We have one dominant search company, one dominant operating system company, one dominant used goods company, one dominant social media company, and you're going to be very rich if you got in on these early and own a significant share of them as their dominance becomes more and more unchallengeable. I don't know how much of inequality can be attributed to these things, but if I were looking for the causes of inequality, I would want to see how much can be attributed to these things, and I would expect that not all that much comes from the growing number of machines and structures that are owned by rich people.
It's an interesting series of discussions in this paper on the classical theories of monopoly rents and just basically profits, that in time profits will go to zero because competition will drive them out. And Rognlie tries to actually detect this by doing some time series analysis and looking at profit as a residual that's not explained by the return of income to either capital or labor here. And it is his surprising conclusion, this is to quote in Robert Solo's response to it in the end, is that it is what Abel Lerner long ago defined as the degree of monopoly for that firm or the representative firm. According to Rognlie's calculation, that is what has been rising for U.S. corporations since about 1980. So how big is it? And some numbers of how big it is. But yeah, it seems to say this quote-unquote pure profit that Rognlie says, the residual from his analyses in the time series, is in fact growing since 1980, which seems to imply some degree of monopoly rents.
Yes.
And I mean this goes hand in hand with the return to housing, which I would like to dive into at some point to the data behind that. But if you have more to say about the classic ideas of what drives inequality, I think there's an interesting point that Brad DeLong in his response makes about the kind of a previous theory that it's all education. It's just there's a more educated class. We're not making education for everybody, and that's driving inequality. But he is certainly skeptical that the mega rich are not just the successful, the skilled, but there seems to be folks that are driving huge incomes and wealth from what do not seem to be, I guess, unique skill.
Yes. Well, there are two aspects of inequality that are growing. One is the inequality between skilled and unskilled workers, and the other is the greater and greater share of income taken by people at the very top. And there will be different explanations of the two. And I think that the growing opportunity to earn monopoly profits may indeed be the explanation of most of the increase in the share of wealth going to those at the very top.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is something you can certainly see in kind of low barrier to entry occupations such as computer science and software engineering, that there are people who make great salaries as employees, but it doesn't seem to even, that's $1 million a year is nothing compared to the returns on the mega rich, the people whose capital works for them.
Well, there aren't very many computer programmers who get salaries of $1 million a year. I suppose that there may be some who are highly skilled in developing games who might get earnings of that sort. But
I'd say that is like a ceiling. That's about as much as a person can ever hope to get by skill. If you talk about in the entire economy, a movie actor or a skilled athlete may get $20 million a year, but that's about as much as you can hope.
Right. And so another thing that came up in, I think it was Solo's comments, but one of the comments at the end of the paper was that the last few decades have seen a growing share of the economy involved in the finance sector. And while it is important to recognize that finance makes a contribution to the productivity of the economy, there's also a suspicion that something has happened to make it possible for the finance sector to capture a return that doesn't reflect its productivity. And I would want to examine that. I think that might be true, but I'm not enough of an expert to be confident of that.
So I guess this paper first came to the attention of many people who are interested in the ideas of Henry George, insofar as there is a very dramatic graph of showing that the return to all non-housing capital versus housing capital, and I believe this is the graph of all G7 nations from 1950 until 2010. And the housing share has been increasing, and increasing quite dramatically, whereas either the weighted or non-weighted for how big the economies are, but for non-housing has been shrinking. And this is something that someone who is sympathetic to the ideas of Henry George tends to see as pretty relevant to what they have been thinking. Well, what do you think the overall relevance is this to the kind of classic ideas of Henry George?
Well, before I could discuss that, I have to talk something about the use of words. When Rognlie uses the word capital, he means what I would mean by the word assets. He regards land as a kind of capital. Now, what words ought to mean is a matter that is determined by a complex social process, and no one person can specify arbitrarily what a word means. But some of our listeners might suppose that when Rognlie talks about the return to housing capital, he means the return to the boards and stones and windows and so on that go into a house. But what he actually means is the return to the combination of the structure and the land. And it's hard to separate out the land and structure components, but Rognlie doesn't do it that I can see.
Well, he uses a lot of the kind of standard orthodox terms. The production function. The production function has two inputs. It has labor and it has everything else, i.e., capital, which is very different than the ideas that we're going through in the classic economics of Adam Smith and David Ricardo, and looked at three factors of production. But we don't. But there is no. There are no practicing economists, as far as I know, who try to use a three-factor production function.
Well, there are a few here and there.
Are they treated very seriously in your take?
Yeah. Well, but you should notice that Rognlie does divide up his concept of capital into structures, equipment, and land. So he recognizes land as a separate factor of production in this sense. But I don't believe that he has a chart showing the return to land or to housing land separate to the return to money invested in constructing housing structures. And it seems to me it would be important to make that distinction, to notice that I suspect that what's been increasing is the return to the ownership of housing land, and that the return to structures may have gone up with the amount of money invested in structures, but the rate of return, the rate of return will be in equilibrium will be the same for all investments. But I think that there has been a remarkable increase in the selling price of land over the past few decades. And this increase in the selling price of land is substantially what is responsible for the growing share of income going to housing.
Yeah, if I understand that point in reference to this paper, there are a few quotes showing that there's a rising return to structures and not just land, but in a lot of modern cases, it's the buying and selling of existing real estate, which is, if through zoning or any other method that's restricted, there's a scarcity of location. You can't build more buildings in one place. So it's not saying construction is getting more expensive. It's saying the location of buildings in places people want them is becoming more scarce.
Yeah. In California, one of the things that happens is you have the Coastal Commission that limits the capacity of people to add to the amount of housing that's in the places where people want to live. And that has increased land prices in California considerably. Now, it may be that part of what's going on there is that people built a lot of houses, and the share of output going to housing is up partly because there are so many more houses than there used to be. But I didn't see the kind of breakdown of the return in the housing sector to a return to more houses versus a growing price of land. That would have been interesting to know about.
Yeah, it reminds me of something that the Nobel laureate Robert Shiller was saying in this past few years or so, that the average return to land has not been increasing overall in the past few decades, but that is saying for any given plot of land in America, what are the chances it increases? And no one's really saying that all land has become more valuable. It is saying that the land that is scarce that people have in demand is becoming increasingly valuable. And there's And I think there's a lot you can kind of confuse when you look at something in aggregate, which tends to belie what really is happening in the economies of that asset.
When I was keeping track of population by counties some years ago, I noticed that census after census, most of the counties in the United States lost population. Most of the counties in the United States are rural, and farms are getting bigger and bigger, and the rural counties just can't support its population as large. So there is a lot of land out in rural counties that's going down in value. Now, this reminds me of another thought I had while reading Piketty, and that is that there's another factor of production that is interesting to think about that has not been brought into his analysis, and that is infrastructure, particularly highways. The existence of highways can greatly influence the value of land. One measure of the economic efficiency of building a highway is that it's worth building if it raises land value by enough to cover the cost of constructing the highway. So we might expect that the selling price of land would rise as governments build more and more highways. And so in a more elaborate model of the kind that Rognlie has built, it would be interesting to take account of government spending on infrastructure as something that one would expect to show up in higher land prices, and ask how much of the increasing share of output that goes to land is a result of infrastructure spending.
Yeah, that's a question that Brad DeLong in his response had snapped onto. He asks how much of this is a real increase in housing intensity, the increasing share of housing. He says how much reflects congestion driven by exhaustion of low-hanging superhighways, which is to say, the highways made lands accessible, but they you certainly run out after time.
Yes. Well, and yet there may be places we may have the opportunity to build large cities in places that don't have them yet. Recent decades have seen great growth, for example, in Dallas and Houston. Is St. Louis capable of the same kind of great growth? Atlanta has grown greatly. A number of cities in Florida have grown, and similarly in Arizona. While the size of any one city is limited to some extent by the greater and greater cost of getting close to the center as you expand, there may be possible centers of growth that haven't grown yet, and as people see their potential, they may grow in the future in ways that we can't predict today.
Yeah, I think you do have to ask a question of what is the limit of how much these cities can grow. And we are seeing more population being added to these cities, but is America capable of growing like the American Hong Kong, or having the American Tokyo, or even making another American New York City? I don't know what kind of chances I think something like this could happen.
Well, I think Boston has a lot of advantages, and I think it could grow more.
I guess like the big cities, like you have your sprawling metropolises, your Atlantas and your Phoenixes, and some infill in places like Houston, but they never quite fill the shape of some of the classically dense cities we see elsewhere.
Yes. Well, you get a classically dense city when you have a intense transportation network of high-speed transit of some kind, subways or something else that gets lots of people to the center of the city without having to have so many highways that they all fill the highways. And New York certainly has the greatest amount of that. Boston, Philadelphia, and Washington have some. Chicago has a significant amount of this high-speed rail transit. So the places that grow to large cities, I think, will be places with such train service. And we may be on the verge of improved technology. When I see the plans that have been proposed for a system in California using a vacuum, I wonder whether in 30 or 40 years we'll have lots of cities with these trains running through tubes with a near vacuum in them.
Yeah, I mean that's Elon Musk's big proposal in the last couple of weeks. Is he was going to have a new series of underground tunnels that will have single passenger vehicles. You kind of imagine, well, if he builds tunnels, you might as well put subways in them. The hard part is building the tunnels.
Yeah. Yes. Well, as well as the technology to make everything safe and efficient, that technology perhaps is where subways were in 1890. And it will be interesting to see whether that brings about a revolution in how large cities can be. It's imaginable that it would. Now, another thing that tends to happen with a transportation technology, something that happened when the car came along, is that the land in the middle of a city becomes less valuable. When it's hard to get to the city because of high transportation costs, it's particularly valuable to be in the center of the city. But when transportation becomes cheaper, it's easier to substitute land away from the center for land in the center. And so the land in the center loses some of its value. So there are complex changes in the pattern of value over distance that can be expected as transportation technology improves.
So as far as the value going to housing, and more questions that are raised here. There's another question by Brad DeLong. How much trust do we place in these imputed rent imputations, and what do they mean anyway? And that's something that grabbed me the first time I read through these paragraphs. The housing data that the government data sources are produced that Rognlie used here have homeowners calculating their own imputed rent, which, as I understand, is their guess of how much their place would rent for if they were renting it, which I'm not sure how much accuracy we should say in a calculation such as that. Is that fair to say?
Yes. Just because it's we don't know how much accuracy is in it doesn't mean that we can dismiss it utterly. What it means is that we're not spending as much on these interesting data questions as we might be spending, and so that people who want to do the kind of analysis that Rognlie does has to make do with less than we would like them to have. It's not his fault that this is all he has to work with.
Oh, certainly. I think, but he's just identifying a few places possible bias, and one piece of possible bias is that the housing costs are actually understated here, in that homeowners, when you actually have already paid off your mortgage, have a tendency to not care or underrate if rents are going up in their city.
Yes, but again, that's something that could be explored if enough effort were put into it.
Yeah, I think I think it's very interesting. Yeah, how he used very, I guess, generally available data. He restricted the major part of his conclusions to the G7 countries because they have the best government data. But even they don't have completely consistent with each other data, or and he just has to make notes here and there. So I enjoy exactly how thorough this paper is in explaining what shortcomings modern data sources have. In your opinion, what should we hope for, I guess, or demand out of our government data sources in order to make sure we have this data for the future?
Well, the main thing that we don't have, I think, is good data on the value of land. And so I think that that's the highest priority.
And what do you think we would need to do to actually get this data? Is it knowable?
Well, there are estimating procedures of variable accuracy. I think that if we had a good record of all real estate transactions across the country and some significant effort on the part of economists to work with the data, we could come up with a reasonable estimate of the value of land. I think that that's probably the way to go, to have a database of all real estate transactions and tease it apart from there.
Yeah, I will note offhand that it seems like the best attempt at this is being done by the private sector, as far as real estate websites such as Zillow actually have done the janitor work to actually make more or less to get the data in one place and actually make estimates on it. It's actually it seems like it's, in my mind, very interesting work from an economic perspective.
Yes, I think that Zillow is only concerned with the selling price of the combination of land and buildings. And I believe they're only interested in the residential part. The commercial part would have to be done separately. But I believe that working with the Zillow database, it would be possible to come up with land estimates. But I'm not sure of that. But that's where I would start, I think. But possibly also with looking at the census data and seeing how that would integrate with the Zillow data. And it would also be important to have whatever information could be found on characteristics of properties. You know, do they have garages? Do they have fireplaces? How many bathrooms do they have? These are the things you would want to know in order to estimate the value of buildings separately from the value of land.
So, taking an overall look at this paper, Piketty's work, Capital in the 21st Century, this makes a few critiques of its major findings. How valid do you think the overall impact of Capital in the 21st Century is in the wake of this paper, in your opinion?
I think that anybody who wants to evaluate the contribution of Piketty would be well advised to take account of this work. I think that it offers a serious limitation on the plausibility of the future that Piketty projects.
And as far as making, I'd say in a certain roundabout way, this makes critiques of the classic two-factor production function, etc. How likely, or I guess how resistant to the profession of economics in academia today do you think it is to actually taking this into account and looking at perhaps not just looking at capital as one homogeneous factor?
I think that Rognlie has taken us an important step in the direction of separating out assets into into components. He uses land, structures, and equipment. I think that we need to take account of infrastructure and government-assigned property rights to patents and other scarce opportunities. But I think that the way that Piketty has been working with the data opens the door to more of the analysis that will include additional segregation of assets into different classes.
And I guess one more question is, a classic Henry George's look at inequality and what it derives from. He finds reasons, but his work is also very imbued with proposals for changing things. And if you go to Piketty, he does promote a wealth tax to make up for what he finds to be the growing share of wealth by the upper tiers of society. There isn't really, in Rognlie's paper, anything really looking at kind of proposals for relieving inequality. Do you think this is that would be out of the scope of this paper?
Yeah, I agree that Rognlie doesn't offer any policy suggestion. He's focused on casting doubt on Piketty's projections. But I would also say that there are classic reasons for not taxing man-made productive assets, machines and buildings, and reasons for concentrating taxes on the assets that are not produced by human effort. And there's nothing that either Piketty or Rognlie says that undermines the argument for concentrating taxes on land and other forms of privilege.
And in talking about production here, he also looks at the share to labor, the share to capital, and finally a direct tax on production, which is something that actually is as I understand, maps only onto the value-added tax, the VAT that we see across the world, but not in America. What do you think the relevance is of a VAT in all this?
Well, from an economic perspective, value-added tax is pretty much equivalent to a sales tax. And we don't have a nationwide sales tax, but we do have sales taxes in lots of states. And I guess one significant difference between a value-added tax and a sales tax is that a value-added tax is often levied at a higher rate than a sales tax. And one reason for this is that it seems likely that tax cheating will be smaller under a value-added tax than under a sales tax that is designed to collect the same revenue. So anyway, a value-added tax is probably better than some other sources of revenue, but not nearly as good as taxing land and privilege.
Yeah, we've been in conversation with Nic Tideman talking about Matthew Rognlie's paper, Deciphering the Fall and Rise and the Net Capital Share, Accumulation or Scarcity, a rebuttal of some points in Tomas Piketty's work, Capital in the 21st Century. In conclusion, when people think back into these findings, what do you think is the most important takeaway of this whole paper?
Well, we shouldn't be concerned about the rich accumulating more and more wealth and therefore getting a greater and greater share of output. The accumulation of wealth is likely to mean that we have a more productive economy. There really isn't a need to defend ourselves against that future, at least in terms of the evidence we have so far. So if we want to tax the rich, we should tax them on their land holdings and their privilege, not on their accumulations of savings.
Well, thank you very much for your time here. I'd love to actually have you back on and talk about your own work, but it's been a pleasure and an honor to have you come on and talk about the importance and a lot of the mathematical nuts and bolts of Matthew Rognlie's paper today on the program. Thanks very much for your time.
You're welcome.
This has been the Henry George Program. You can find previous episodes and more information online at seethecat.org. This is brought to you by KZSU Stanford.